They peer inside of people all day long. They see everything alive. It's not frozen like the X-ray technicians. These are the ones who are trained to do sonograms. They see everything in 3D or 4D. Tatiana Gura lost her sight when she was 17 years old. Now she's 30 and pregnant with her son. And so she was scheduled to undergo a sonogram, knowing full well that she could not see the image on the screen that the technician saw. So the people of the hospital, the doctors and the nurses, with the help of a Huggy machine, reproduced a 3D cast of her little boy's head. And they gave it to Tatiana in her hospital bed, and she felt of it with her fingers, and she said these words, "I am happy to meet Maria before he is born." We don't think about sonograms much until we have to have one. But it's amazing that in the technology of the 2000s, you were able to see a living person inside the mother's womb. And they say at Thrive that is one thing that saves the life of more little babies than anything else. A simple sonogram. Now, as I understand it, the little one-celled baby attaches itself to the wall of the uterus lining, and it adheres to that wall and receives oxygen and nutrients from its mother to be able to grow. Human embryos typically produce a chemical called trypsin, and trypsin signals the womb to prepare the lining to be implanted there. And so when the little cell gives out the signals to the womb, it's like a test that's given to the cell by the womb, an entrance exam, before it can adhere to the lining of the uterus. The embryo needs to pass this little test before it can implant in its mother's womb. That's why some people fail fertility tests, because the cell is not able to unite with the mother. Murillo passed the test, and so did Jesus. We don't think much about what happened before Jesus was conceived, because people today understand that life happens at conception. But the Bible teaches, and Christians know, that Jesus was alive before he was conceived. He was alive before he was conceived. And so this morning, I want to talk about the word planted. Just a very simple word. And when you understand what happened to Jesus at Christmas time, it will begin to help us all understand why God works the way he does in our lives. Jesus first was planted in his mother's womb. I remember when I was in high school, we lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we went up to Fort Wayne, Indiana to visit some people who had a farm. And I'd never been to a farm before because I lived in the city almost all of my life. And so we went up to the farm, and we were about to go out to the barn. And they explained to me that I was going to have to put on some coveralls before I went to the barn because it was really important for cleanliness' sake. So I'm just a freshman in high school. I put on these big coveralls that just overwhelm me, and I go out to the barn, and I immediately see the importance of the coveralls because there was filth everywhere. Then I came back to the house, I took off the coveralls, and I was perfectly prepared for the events of the rest of the day. Those coveralls gave me the opportunity to associate with the circumstances that I wouldn't have been able to. And so if you think about Christmas as Jesus putting on coveralls, coming down to this planet, only when he did, he became one cell, embedded in the womb of his teenage mother, Mary. Paul describes it this way in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped or held onto, but emptied himself. Jesus was planted in his mother's womb as one tiny little cell. Paul goes on to explain this in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, when he says, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law." Now, why did God do that? Why did God ask his Son to become one tiny little cell? Hebrews tells it this way. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 17. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect. Jesus had to go through the stages an embryo goes through in its mother's womb. Jesus was in the womb of Mary when Mary went to visit Elizabeth. And Jesus grew in Mary's womb, and when she made the trip back to Bethlehem 3 months later, he was closer to being born. And when he was back in Nazareth, his mother and his father, and his stepfather, Joseph, agreed that they would marry, knowing full well what it would look like to the little community of Nazareth. Joseph and Mary stepped into shame and stepped into reproach, knowing full well that the entire community of Nazareth would believe what wasn't true, that they had been intimate with one another before they'd gotten married. Now, in these days, that's no big deal. But back when Jesus was born, a virgin was considered tantamount to the importance of the establishment of a family. And they had violated the laws of Israel and were looked down upon by the people of Nazareth, and they had to deal with that for 9 months. Jesus was planted in his mother's womb. And then he was born in Bethlehem. So it says in Luke chapter 2, verses 4 through 7, so Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. Now, I don't understand how God works, but this was important to God. Joseph and Mary had to leave with the implanted Jesus in her womb to go south to Bethlehem. And then it says they went because Joseph was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. Now, when we were over in Israel, they said that the reason Mary and Joseph weren't allowed to spend the night in the inn was because it would cost the innkeeper much money. Because if a child were born in one of his rooms, it would cause the room to be unclean for months. And so because the innkeeper was concerned about the rent and the money he would receive renting out these rooms, he didn't allow Joseph and Mary to have the baby in the inn, but they were forced to have the child in a manger. And so the baby, Jesus, who was the Son of God, was born in these circumstances. And she gave birth, Luke says, to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. So Jesus was implanted in his mother's womb, and for 9 months they lived in Nazareth, and then they were uprooted and they had to move to Bethlehem. You know, sometimes in life, we don't know why things happen and why we have to change geography and logistics. And sometimes in our lives, we feel like this is where it needs to be, and then all of a sudden, circumstances come about and we have to move. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves in a place in Bethlehem where our relatives live, but we're not used to being in Bethlehem. We're not used to giving birth. We're a rookie mother. And all of a sudden, we're in a town, a foreign town. We're not surrounded by our family. We're not surrounded by people that are support group. And all of a sudden, we're experiencing things in life that we aren't prepared to handle by ourselves. Why did God do that? Because years before, he had a conversation with Micah, and Micah said this, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days." And so Mary and Joseph have Jesus, and they settle down and live in Bethlehem for 2 years probably. Their family is up in Nazareth, and Mary and Joseph and Jesus are in Bethlehem for 2 years. The wise men come, they greet them, and then Mary and Joseph suddenly have to be uprooted again. They're planted, Jesus is planted in Mary's womb in Nazareth. They travel to Bethlehem, and now they're uprooted again. I don't know if you've ever had circumstances in your life where you have all the plans laid out, you have everything the way it's supposed to be, and all of a sudden, through a series of circumstances, you are uprooted for something that you have kind of made familiar to yourself. And all of a sudden, they have to leave. They don't have a choice. They can't pick the circumstances. They have to get out of town. And so it says in Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.'" They have no choice. They have to leave. Now this confuses me, because God went to great lengths to get Jesus, to get the Israelites out of Egypt. He sent Moses to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. And now he's wanting his son to go back to Egypt with his mom and dad. Why would God do that? Why would God want Jesus and Mary and Joseph to go to Egypt? So it says, "And he rose, took the child and his mother by night, departed Egypt." They make the long trip at nighttime and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I've called my son." Well, the reason that happened is because in Hosea 11:1, it says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." In 43 AD, Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, went to Egypt and established the church there. And the Coptic Christian church is one of the oldest churches in the world. And the reason Mark had success when he went to Egypt to plant and to share the gospel is because of this one little thing. The trip that Mary and Joseph and Jesus made to Egypt, when Hosea says, "Out of Egypt I've called my son." So they're in Egypt. They hear word that Herod dies, and they're uprooted again. Sounds like they're in the army. Like they're having to change locations and change locales over and over again. This young family. By now, Jesus is probably about 3 or 4 years old. And so once again, they have to pick up and move. So it says in Matthew chapter 2, verses 19 to 21, but when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. So now they pick up, they pack, they move to Israel, but they have no clue where they're going to go. Now, I don't know if you've ever had that happen to you or not in your life, in your experiences as a family, as a couple, as a single. Well, all of a sudden, you're sort of at loose ends. You don't know where you're supposed to go. You don't know where you go north or south or east or west. You don't know what job you want. You've maybe gotten a degree in one thing, but now all of a sudden you're sort of at loose ends and you don't know where to go and you don't know what's going to happen to you. Mary and Joseph are in Israel, but they don't quite know what they're going to do next. And then it says in Matthew chapter 2, verses 22 and 23, but when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth. The same city they'd grown up in, the same city where the people knew and looked at them through strange eyes. Now they decided, even though they knew what it was going to be when they got there, even though they knew what people were going to think, even though they knew what the rumor and gossip was going to be, Mary and Joseph decided, let's go home. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to go home. I know one of the toughest things for me was when I got out of college. Actually, when I was in college, I went home after my freshman year. I don't know if you remember that or not for you, but you go home and you think it's going to be the way it was when you left. Only when you go to college, you learn how to do your own laundry, you learn how to handle your own money, you learn how to handle your own schedule, you learn how to handle your time, you learn when you want to wake up and when you want to go to bed, you learn when you want to go out, when you want to stay home, you learn whatever you want to eat, and now all of a sudden you go home and you're grown up and your parents want you still to be a kid. So you go home and you start doing things you did at college, and your parents have to deal with the rigors of trying to make those adjustments. And all of a sudden you realize in the depths of your soul, sometimes it's really hard to go home. So Mary and Joseph go back to Nazareth, and they try to set up shop. They try to make their place for their family. They have all these children. And it says in Luke chapter 2, verse 51, and he went with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And then in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, it says, Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son of Joseph, the son of Heli. And all of a sudden, Jesus leaves for good. Now, I guess the reason this fascinates me is because we're talking about missionaries today. And if anybody has to pick up and move, it's missionaries. But a lot of times we don't think about that. We don't think about missionaries who have families, who have traditions, who have cultures in their homes, who have ways of doing things. And all of a sudden, because of their commitment and surrender to God, they have to pick up and move. And so Mary and Joseph, because they surrendered to God, all of a sudden they have to pick up and move to Bethlehem. Then they have to pick up and move to Egypt. And then they have to pick up and move to Israel. And then they have to pick up and move to Nazareth. And then they have to Jesus picks up and moves to Capernaum. And he does all this because he's planted in certain places at certain times. When I got out of college, one of the challenges you have to deal with when you get out of college is you have to decide what you're going to do when you grow up. And so I decided that I received a call from a church in Enid, Oklahoma, that they wanted a youth minister. And so Keisha and I showed up, and Keisha and I got married in August of that year, and then she became a minister's wife, and we were there for about 19 months. That's all, 19 months. And you think to yourself, well, Lord, what's the point of that? I mean, why take a job that's only 19 months long? I mean, it seems to me like you should provide a job for somebody that's a lot longer than that, but you provided a job that was 19 months long. And you think to yourself, what can you do in 19 months? What can you accomplish in 19 months? What can you do as far as furthering what you're supposed to do as a Christian in 19 months? I was 22 years old, and I didn't know a thing about being a youth minister. I didn't know a thing about teenage kids. I didn't know a thing about being married. And here I was in Enid, Oklahoma, the youth minister for a youth group of about 100 kids. I was trying to figure out how to be married, and I was trying to figure out what God was trying to tell me, and I was there for just 19 months. Do you know what? Last week, we met at a restaurant over in near Firewheel, one of the kids from my youth group. She's 6'4". She has a sister that's 6'2". She has a brother that's 7'4" and was a jailer down at the Dallas jail. These kids are still my friends. I was only there for 19 months. But out of that youth group and out came relationships with people that have lasted almost 50 years. And God knows what he's doing sometimes when he plants you a certain place and then he uproots you and puts you in another place. He knows what he's doing when he puts you in a dorm room, when you go away to school. He knows what he's doing when he assigns you to be deployed in another country with your family back in the United States. He knows what he's doing when he puts you in a hospital bed to coalesce when all of a sudden you're infirmed and you don't know what you're going to do. He knows what he's doing when he's doing that. He knows what he's doing when you have to go to Canada to work in a job, leaving your wife and your kids back in Dallas, and she becomes a single parent for 2 years while you do that. He knows what he's doing when you have to go to be deployed in a ship and your wife is taking care of your kids stateside, and you come back when the deployment is over and you have to reconfigure all that's going on in your family. God knows what he's doing when those short things happen. He knows what he's doing when you have to go to Washington, D.C. for a couple of years and leave your house and your family at home. He knows what he's doing with all those things. And God knows what he's doing now in your life and mine, just like he knew what he was doing in the life of Mary and Joseph and Jesus when he moved them from place to place. And sometimes it doesn't seem like God has a clue what he's doing. But then you look back at your life, and you look back at those moments, and you look back at those months that you were detached from people and circumstances, and all of a sudden you look back and you see over and over again what God has done in those moments of moving and being uprooted and having to readjust and make new friends and all those kinds of things. And then it says Jesus moved to Capernaum. And leaving Nazareth, Matthew tells us in Matthew 4, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, I think it's important for us to understand one thing. When Jesus moved to Nazareth and when he moved to Capernaum, being from Nazareth wasn't a compliment. Being from Nazareth meant that you were near a Roman garrison. The Roman garrison collected taxes from Jewish people in Galilee. People in northern cities who interacted with Romans were considered lowlifes. And when Jesus was called a Nazarene, it wasn't a title of honor. It was a title of sarcasm. It was Pilate making fun of the King of the Jews who came from Nazareth. And yet Jesus wore that title with dignity. And when Pilate put on the cross, King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth, and when the Jews went to Pilate and said, we want you to remove that, Pilate says, I have written what I have written. And basically what that's saying is this. Every time Jesus moved, every time Jesus was uprooted, he was doing it for a significant reason. And that reason is this. The purpose of all the moving, the purpose of being mobile, of saying to people, foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. The purpose of it all was that Jesus ultimately was posturing to be planted in you. And there were no circumstances that Jesus ever faced in his life that would be so daunting, that would be so such a problem to him, that Jesus wouldn't say, I will live there. I will live in a place that other people might consider to be embarrassing. I will live in a place and I will make my home there for the duration. I will live there and I will make sure to make my home there, even though I understand what the assignment is. And Christmas tells us that when Jesus is born and becomes a cell in the womb of his mother, that Jesus will go to any length to be born in you. Paul said it this way. The mystery that has been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the saints. To them God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And Paul goes on in Colossians chapter 3, verse 15 to say these words, let the peace of Christ rule in your heart. And then he says in Colossians 3, verse 16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. So when you look at the birth of Jesus and you scratch your head and you think, God, I wouldn't have done it that way. I would have just had Jesus born in Egypt to save the trips. I would have had Jesus born in Nazareth and just called it a day. I would have had Jesus born in Capernaum and he wouldn't have had to done all that moving. Why in the world did you have Jesus conceived in Mary as a virgin, have to move from Nazareth to Bethlehem, have to move from Bethlehem to Egypt, have to move from Egypt to Israel, have to move from Israel back to Nazareth, and then go to Capernaum and end up, of all places, on a cross. Why did you do that? And God would say, oh, it's simple. I did all that so he could be born in you. It's simple. So when Mary said to the angel, may it be as you have said, and that little cell was planted in her womb by the hand of God. She had no idea the moves she would make, the changes she would make, the homes she would have to set up over and over and over again, the friends she would have to leave and make new friends in other places, the adjustments she would have to make with her husband and with her family. She had no idea that when that little cell was transferred to her womb, what awaited her. But the Bible says of Mary, and she remembered all these things and treasured them in her heart. So we could gather today in this place and look back over moments and times in our lives when we were moved and moved and moved and moved from dorms to apartments to houses, back to apartments again, maybe to a rehab center, maybe to a retirement center. All these things happen to us, and we look back and we think, what was that all about? God would say to us and will say to us, every single one had meaning and purpose, and I was in all of it. So this morning, if you are not a Christian, a lot of times moves happen in our lives to do one thing, to show us our desperate need for Jesus and to cause us to come to him. If you're here this morning and you've moved all over and you have never made a church your home, you've never put yourself under the spiritual umbrella of men and women who have your best interests at heart. That's what church is all about. That's why we have church, is for you to find a home. Or if you're here this morning and you've been upset and bitter and frustrated because of all these changes that have gone on in your life, losing jobs, having to move, do all these things, and you look at all that and you think, this makes absolutely no sense. Perhaps, if you went to God today, with the help of our guys who will be up here to pray for you, all of a sudden, the fog might lift and you might go, oh my goodness, that's what that was all about. I remember Nita and her husband-to-be, Charlie, asked me to marry them. And they wanted to get married in Oklahoma City. So we made the drive from Dallas to Oklahoma City to be there for their wedding. I'll never forget this. So comes the time for the wedding, and everybody walks in. And Charlie, for some reason, seemed to think that he needed to have friends over 6 feet tall. And so all these guys come forward, and they're all over 6 feet tall. And Nita was there. Of course, her sister had to be her maid of honor, who was 6'2", and then her other sister, who was over 6 feet. And there are all these people. And so you could not see me when I was marrying these people. And when I began to speak, it almost echoed like I was in a canyon, or something like that. And you think to yourself, how did I get here? How did this happen? Well, it happened because God plants here, he uproots and moves you here, and then through a series of circumstances, you end up here, and all of a sudden, you go, oh, that's what that was all about. And that's what God wants to do for you.